This last year has been just a horrific year, more than 500,000 dead, a number it's almost impossible to fathom. A system riddled with racial inequities laid bare, and a country that's deeply divided on almost every aspect. But the one silver lining has been the vaccines. Before this, the fastest development of a vaccine that I'm aware of is mumps, and that took about 4 years. So to go from a pathogen we knew absolutely nothing about last year to now multiple vaccine candidates that work so well is miraculous, or rather, nothing at all to do with miracles. It's actually science at its best. And Peter Hotez knows almost everything about this vaccine development. So we're really fortunate to have him answering these questions. So, Peter, can you tell us, how did we get here? How did we get these vaccines so fast?
Well, thanks, Apoorva. By the way, I didn't know you had a degree in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin, which is one of the great biochemistry departments. They've made so many contributions coming out of Madison, Wisconsin, in biochemistry, and my PhD's in biochemistry also. I think one of the myths that I like to always dispel is that somehow these vaccines arose out of nowhere in weeks and months. For the simple reason it's not true. This whole vaccine development program and Operation Warp Speed would never be possible without the fact that there was at least a decade of research and development going into coronavirus vaccines. That's when we first got into it, and arguably others have been into it even before then. And we needed that time to actually show that the spike protein is the soft target of the coronavirus, especially the receptor binding domain component. We needed that time to show that you can deliver the spike protein in different ways, whether it was through genetic immunization, RNA, or recombinant proteins, or inactivated viruses. We needed to show that it was virus neutralizing antibody that was an essential component of immunity to coronaviruses, maybe not the only component. T-cell responses are also necessary, but you have to have those virus neutralizing antibodies as well. So all of that went into feeding into when the Chinese scientists first put up the COVID-19 virus sequence, the SARS coronavirus type 2, back in bioRxiv, which is a preprint server that came out of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories. When they put it up in the middle of January, our community of scientists looked at this and said, we got this. We can make this vaccine, because we had made SARS vaccines, the original SARS that came out of southern China in 2003, MERS vaccines. So we knew that this was going to be a possibility. I think but the public doesn't have that knowledge or perception. What they have is what came from the public, from the press releases from the pharma CEOs, who, and you have to remember, when they put out a press release, they're not writing it for you or for me, they're writing it for their shareholders. And when they do that, they tend to spectacularize their accomplishments. And I don't want to diminish their accomplishments, but it failed to mention all the decade of research that went, R&D that went into it. And the reason I say that is not because of sour grapes or anything along those lines. I mean, we used to develop our own coronavirus vaccines. I say it because the anti-vaccine lobby has used this very aggressively in their outreach to make claims that how could these vaccines be safe or effective? Everyone knows it takes a decade at least to make a vaccine. It's not possible that they made a vaccine in a period of weeks. And they're right. It didn't happen over a period of weeks. It happened over 10 years. But they're using this against us. So we're sort of, I'm spending a fair bit of time doing damage control around those company press releases to make it clear that when you look at the timelines of this COVID-19 vaccines, it really follows the same progression as almost any other vaccine. And the clinical trials are massive, 30 to 60,000 person clinical trials conducted with a lot of integrity and oversight by our FDA. The only part that has really been accelerated is the fact that once we showed efficacy and safety after a couple of months, the vaccines were released through emergency use authorization rather than waiting a full year of collecting data for that. And the reason was because by waiting that extra year, when you're getting to 3,000 Americans losing their lives every day, you do the math, would be a staggering loss of life. But the truth is the vaccine development cycle for COVID-19 vaccines very much goes along with what we've seen before. And there are some variances, but modest. And I think that's an important story for people to know if they're concerned about taking COVID-19 vaccines.
I think the safety issue seems to also stem from the name of the entire project. I've heard a lot of people say, the Operation Warp Speed, that really makes them think that there were some steps that were skipped. But
it was a terrible name. I don't know what the heck they were thinking, but you could not have picked a more unfortunate name.
I'm sure they were thinking it makes them sound really good, but they're doing this really quickly. But yeah, warp speed is not exactly what you want when you're thinking about the safety of vaccines. But can you talk
I forget if it was on MSNBC or CNN, because there wasn't a lot of transparency out of Operation Warp Speed. So I made the statement that I think they also have a cloaking device attached to their attached to Operation Warp Speed, if you know about the Klingons in Star Trek.
We'll have to have that conversation another time, but can you talk a little bit about what we know of the safety of the vaccines, especially now that we have tens of millions of people vaccinated in this country and many more in the rest of the world?
That's right. So we did, pretty big clinical trials, 30 to 60,000 people, and that's a good sized clinical trial. If you're going to see any common safety signal or safety flare, you'll see it over that period, but you never really know till you start seeing millions of doses go into the arms of people. And so far it's looking pretty good. The level of severe allergic reaction is a little higher than flu or HPV vaccine. So we've looked into this. So roughly the likelihood of you're having an anaphylactic or severe allergic reaction from flu or HPV vaccine, human papillomavirus vaccine for cervical cancer and other cancers, is about 1 to 2 per million. Whereas this one is a little bit higher, up to 2 to 10 per million. So about 3 to 4 times higher, but it's still a rare event. But that's the reason why we ask people to stay another 15 to 30 minutes after they've been immunized in case they happen to be unlucky and be one of those. But, to give you a sense of what that means, it's about, those numbers are roughly about the likelihood of being struck by lightning in your lifetime, which has been put at about 1 in 750,000 by National Geographic. In fact, I even, in my book, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, I even have a chapter called Struck by Lightning to talk about that. And so that gives you a sense. So the safety profile looks really good. People are concerned about Bell's palsy, which is temporary facial paralysis of the facial nerve that causes one side of your face to droop. It's whether or not that's really related to the vaccine is unknown, because it occurred also in people who didn't get the vaccine. So overall, the safety profile is looking quite good. Is basically other vaccines, and the FDA has, and the CDC have, a very elaborate system of monitoring afterwards. It's not like they release the vaccine under emergency use and say adios. This is right. Done. We've got this parallel tracks in place: the vaccine adverse events reporting system, vaccine safety data link, about 3 or 4 parallel systems. So it's very carefully monitored,
and the app, which is
it's robust. And I'm sorry.
And the app, which is completely new just for this vaccine, so people can report symptoms.
Yeah, no, the system's robust, and it has detected rare safety events from rotavirus vaccines and others in the past. So we know it works. So the point is, our FDA is, I consider, the flagship national regulatory authority, the FDA and the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, incredible track record of releasing safe and effective vaccines. And then afterwards, this very carefully constructed monitoring path. So the one thing I can feel, and that's why I said, back last year, I said, I will take the first vaccine offered to me, released under emergency use authorization by the FDA. That's how confident I feel. And I did. I was offered the Pfizer vaccine and I got my 2 immunizations. But if they presented me with the Moderna vaccine, I would have taken it. And now we'll probably get the J&J, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine out of Janssen Labs, released probably next week. I would have taken that as well.
That's actually exactly segues into my next question, which is going to be, we're going to probably see J&J's approval this weekend. And we probably, Novavax is not far behind and AstraZeneca is probably not far behind, although we haven't really seen that much of it here. I'm just wondering, though, when you see these data that come out of AstraZeneca in South Africa, for example, or you hear about how Johnson & Johnson has done, or Novavax in South Africa, would you really take any vaccine knowing that the variants are circulating? Are the vaccines all equally good? What is the difference?
So it's a great question. And we don't have all of the information yet. It's, first of all, so far, all of the Operation Warp Speed vaccines, in addition to the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which has not been approved by the FDA yet, work really well against what some people call the UK variant, the B117 variant that arose out of the United Kingdom. And that's probably likely going to be the dominant variant we're going to see in the United States. With the South with the South African variant, or what some people call the B.1.351, I don't know who comes up with these designations. They're not very memorable, but that one, what happens is you've got not only an amino acid substitution in the 501 position, but you have another one in the 484 that's creating tighter binding. And it turns out that the virus neutralizing antibodies, which is how all these vaccines work, against the original variant, when you test it against the South African variant, it goes down. And so the way I think it's going to shape up is those vaccines that give you really high virus neutralizing antibodies to begin with against that South African variant, there'll be a reduction in the amount of virus neutralizing antibodies, but still enough so it'll work. I think that's going to be true of the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, the J&J vaccine, the Novavax vaccine. The only problem one is going to, in terms of the ones that could be released in the US, is the AstraZeneca vaccine, which starts out at a much lower level of virus neutralizing antibody, still enough for the UK variant, but the numbers are looking like it's not going to work very well against the South African variant. But, we don't have that one here in abundance yet. And then you get things like the Russian Gamaleya vaccine, a couple of the Chinese vaccines out of Sinovac and CanSino Bio. Those are also really low levels of virus neutralizing antibody. I think likely it's quite possible they won't protect against the South African variant as well. But most of the others, we should get cross protection. Then the question is, which one's going to win out in the US, as we're starting to see these variants accelerate? Is it going to be the UK? Is it going to be the South African one? Is it going to be the Brazil one, which is now in Minnesota and elsewhere? Is it going to be the new California one we're hearing about? Is it going to be the new New York one that was reported a couple of days ago? And the answer is we don't really know. Some colleagues that I've spoken to and who are experts in virus evolutionary genetics feel the UK one looks like the most likely candidate to be the dominant one, which is bad news, and because it causes greater levels of transmission, is more contagious, and the UK government's putting up that it causes higher mortality. The good news is your vaccine should work really well against the UK variant.
You actually answered a couple of questions from the audience. People wanted to know about the Sinovac vaccine. Just a quick note for people who are dropping questions. I was just taking a quick look. we can't really offer advice for very specific scenarios of, I'm this many years old, I have these conditions. That is really a conversation that's best for your doctor. Would you agree with that, Peter?
Yeah, my inbox is just flooded with those questions. And I just can't. If I answered them, I just couldn't do anything else. That would be my full-time job. And my heart
And
goes
it's
out
also
to
hard, right?
It's not that they're not good questions. It's just that, you can't spend too much time with it.
Plus, it seems like it's a conversation, a longer conversation with your doctor,
That's right.
with all
That's right.
of the variables that might be at play. So, when do you think we will go from the EUA to full approval? And because they were able to skip some steps, right? They didn't have to do the reproductive toxicity studies right away, for example, and they could postpone that. So when will we see all of that? And when can we expect to see vaccines for pregnant women and for kids?
Well, I think all of the vaccines should go through the full approval process. And in my understanding in conversations with Steve Hahn and others with the FDA is that they made that commitment. They're going to go through the full approval process, and it should be a matter of months, not years, when they apply for what's called a BLA, a biologics license application. And that's really important because there are some things that you would do with the full BLA that you might not do just under emergency use. So I think that's going to be absolutely critical. So they all will go through that process. And then in terms of pregnancy, that's going to be a tough call, although I personally have a strong opinion about it, which is that given how badly pregnant women do with COVID-19 in terms of hospitalization rates and ICU admissions, I feel strongly they should get the vaccine. If for my daughter or my, a family member, I would encourage them to get the COVID vaccine. More or less, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology and the Maternal Fetal Medicine Society agree with that position, but they're a little more cautious in how they say it. And it's kind of, I wish they would have come out with a little more direct statement. It leaves too much to having mom or the family decide what decision they should make. This is why physicians do residency training and do fellowship training, is because they should be able to provide more direct, concrete advice. But it's basically there, I think, and the other added benefit, I think, could be that if they get vaccinated, those antibodies, those virus neutralizing antibodies, potentially could get passed on to the newborn, so that your newborn is protected as well, at least in the first few weeks of life. So I think there are a lot of benefits, and it's very scary what's happening to pregnant women who get COVID-19. What happened when the clinical trials, the phase 3 trials, if you were pregnant, you were excluded from participating in the clinical trials, but a number of women became pregnant during the phase 3 trial. And as far as I know, we have not seen untoward effects, but the truth is it hasn't been fully analyzed, and we don't have what's called that reproductive toxicology studies in laboratory animals, which takes time to do. But I think that green light will come. And certainly the FDA did not give any contraindication to pregnancy.
Yeah, I think the few the reproductive toxicity studies that have been in from Moderna and Pfizer so far haven't shown any bad effects. So hopefully that trend will continue. And the app, the last time I looked at it, I think it was about 30,000 pregnant women who had participated in the app, although some of them maybe, not pressed the pregnant button by mistake, apparently. But we should still have some information from that, right, about safety and in pregnant
absolutely
women.
I mean, the thing that I'm most worried about now is these variants are accelerating rapidly. It's already a major percentage of the COVID-19 virus isolates in Florida and Southern California and elsewhere. This thing is revving up. And the biggest problem I'm seeing right now is, in the news reports, we're always hearing about how the cases are declining dramatically. And it's true. We've gone from 250,000 confirmed cases in early January to around 50 to 60,000 new cases, so an 80% decline. But now in many states, that decline is leveling off, and it's curious to see how that leveling off and the decline are also in states that seem to have variants, like Florida, for instance, or New York. So I'm quite concerned that now we're going to start to see a leveling, and then it's going to shoot back up. And this is going to be the toughest time, I think, for us as those variants begin to accelerate. We're basically told the mother load of vaccines is really not going to be here till June or July, including the J&J vaccine, which is disappointing that they're only going to have about 3-4 million doses.
I was going to ask you about that, actually.
So the big picture is we're going to be in a very good position summer and fall, but I'm really worried about the country for the month of March and April, or maybe into May, how we navigate that. And, or as I've been saying, beware the Ides of March. This is going to be a scary time.
Yeah. I think you might know, but I just wrote an article about this, and almost everyone I talked to said there will be a fourth wave, which was not very reassuring. But on the topic of why we haven't had more vaccines, the availability, people have criticized, first of all, the rollout quite a bit, but also why can we not turn every company into a vaccine manufacturing plant? Given the urgency.
Well, first of all, the NIH and the Operation Warp Speed program went very heavy on the innovation side. I pushed hard to bring in some old school vaccines that we can accelerate. For instance, we're making a recombinant protein vaccine in collaboration with Biological E in Hyderabad in India. They're making 1.2 billion doses. It seems like they're doing it without even breaking into a sweat. Older school technology. They went very high in the innovation, and you can't, in some ways, you can't argue with success. The RNA vaccines are giving really high levels of protection. Same with the adenovirus, but there isn't that ability or knowledge base to know how to scale it up quickly. And we're still in a learning curve about how to produce it. 5 years from now, we'll know how to scale up rapidly production of RNA vaccines. And we'll probably also know how to keep it stable at room temperature, but not now. And same with the adenovirus vaccines. We've never made these at scale before. So it's not so much, people say, well, just take over a factory. You can't just take over a Ford Motor plant and now start making adenovirus vaccines. And the reason is the absence of human capital. There are not enough people trained in how to make vaccines and the quality control and quality assurance. Just like the problem with the ICU admissions. It wasn't the beds. You can convert any bed into an ICU bed, but you needed the trained nurses and hospital staff. Same is true of the vaccines. I think for me, one of the disappointments for, coming out of Operation Warp Speed, other than the name and the lack of communication, leaving it to the pharma CEOs, was this whole business of manufacturing at risk turned out not to be the case, right? What we were told all last year is one of the reasons we're going to call it warp speed is because we're already making this stuff, and as soon as the vaccines get released by emergency use authorization, 100 million or more doses will be made available. And it's simply not true. I mean, we're going to get a trickle now of the J&J vaccine, and hopefully later on. And that's disappointing because we really need these vaccines now with the new variants accelerating.
So I've been looking at the questions, and it's kind of fun for me to see a bunch of my former colleagues popping up in these questions. I want to combine a couple of different ones. Joey Romano wants to know, what is known so far about the new variant found in New York City? And I can answer this one quickly since I just wrote about this. I don't think we know that much. It has a mutation that we've seen in the South African variant, B1351, as Peter was saying.
Yeah, it doesn't have the 501Y, but it has the 484K, so it creates a little closer binding to the receptor. So we don't know, and And
It changes the shape of the protein, right?
Yeah, and will it cause more higher level of transmission? Possibly. Will it be more lethal? We don't know. We don't really know that for any of them. All we know, for even the UK variant, the B117, the UK government has put up some information which has not gone through peer review on the UK government website, that they think that it's higher mortality. When I originally saw that, I thought it was because the hospital systems were getting overwhelmed, and that was but I think there is something to it. So we just don't know. And then the question's going to be, all right, so now you've got all of these variants in play, and they're going to start to overlap geographically. Which one outcompetes the others? And it's anybody's guess. Many people seem to think it's the UK variant. But
yeah, it's actually kind of, I don't know, funny or sad that I've had several people say to me, I really hope it's the UK one that takes off, because everyone's so worried about the South Africa one. And we're basically in a state where we're hoping that the more transmissible one takes off rather than the one that maybe dodges the immune system. It's like,
the thing we have to do is we have to accelerate our vaccination timetable. I mean, I think the Biden administration put in a great plan in place to get America fully vaccinated by the fall. It was a big undertaking. We're talking, at least 80% of the US population, roughly 250 million people, most of the vaccines 2 doses. Back of the envelope calculation is 500 million immunizations by the fall. And now we realize, no, we that's too late. We're going to have to figure out a way to move that timetable up and double our 1.7 million immunizations a day to 3 million immunizations a day, and then figure out where the vaccine's going to come from, in addition to creating all the hubs to make that possible.
We have a really interesting question here from Nina Brooks Masters. She's asking, I know the focus right now is really on COVID vaccines and corresponding vaccine hesitancy, but she's worried about downstream effects on vaccinations for other things like measles, mumps, etc.
Yeah, we actually have 2 problems. One, because parents have been reluctant to go out and see the pediatrician or their pediatric nurse practitioner. There's been a decline in the number of kids being kept up with their MMR, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, and other vaccines. There's been some rebound now, but that's still a problem, and you worry it's going to be kept down. And then it's worth remembering, even before COVID-19, we've had a pretty horrible anti-vaccine, anti-science movement that really accelerated in 2015. It really took off in Texas and Oklahoma under this fake banner of health freedom, medical freedom. That's when you saw political action committees form like Texans for Vaccine Choice. So things are pretty bad in Texas right now. We have over 72,000 kids being denied access to their vaccines. And those are the ones we know about. We don't know anything about the 300,000, 350,000 homeschooled kids. So we easily have 100,000 kids being denied access to their vaccinations. And that's one of the reasons I wrote an earlier book, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, because my youngest daughter, Rachel, has autism and intellectual disabilities. And here I am, a vaccine scientist and pediatrician. So if I don't write that book, who will? And that's really made life very interesting for me, going up against this very aggressive, well-funded, now well-organized anti-vaccine lobby that dominates the internet. And you've seen it, they go after me quite a bit. In fact, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., one of the most active anti-vaccine activists, has publicly labeled me on his Instagram account the OG villain, which I had to look up. It means the original gangster villain. So the Simons Foundation is hosting the original gangster villain today, and it's tough. They are, they have that organization, and one of the problems is all those anti-vaccine groups. What happened was in 2020, the ones coming out of political extremism on the far right, over these fake concepts of medical freedom, health freedom, what they did in 2020, they glommed on protests not only against vaccines, but masks and social distancing. So they became a full-on anti-science movement. And what I always say is the reason we've lost 500,000 American lives is not only because of the SARS coronavirus type 2 and the lack of a federal response, leaving it to the states in 2020, but also this defiance that comes out of political extremism on the right. And I think that was a big factor in the deaths that we saw last summer as the virus tore through the southern states, including Texas. And then in the Midwest in the fall, a lot of those deaths could have been prevented. And it's getting scary. Now what we're seeing is those same groups have been involved in speaking at rallies in Western Europe over the summer. There were anti-mask, anti-vaccine rallies in Trafalgar Square in London, in Paris, in Berlin, where they actually stormed the Reichstag, the German parliament, much like they stormed the Capitol. And the New York Times and BBC reported it's linked to QAnon and other extremist groups. And then on top of that, you have the Putin government, U.S. And British intelligence report about the Russians are piling on our internet with a whole systematic program of what's being called weaponized health communication. So what we're facing now that very few people want to confront is a globalized anti-science empire, with Russia. And how you talk about that is difficult, right? Because, if you say in one breathless sentence, QAnon and neo-Nazi groups and Putin and the Russian government, you yourself start sounding like someone who throws things at the TV at night. So how you say it in a way that's credible is really important. But I've been pushing hard now for the Biden administration to finally do something about this, because in the past, the Centers for Disease Control has not wanted to take on the anti-vaccine lobby. They very much have maintained a position. Look, Peter, we're not going to call attention to this because we'll give it oxygen. And I said, well, that made sense 20 years ago, but now that horse has left the barn, that train has left the station. It's we've got to do something about it. So, not only bringing in the Health and Human Services agencies, but I feel we're going to have to bring in the Commerce Department, Justice Department, Homeland Security. It's a Homeland Security issue, and even State Department, given the Russian involvement. And I tend to be an outlier on this one. Most people just don't want to go there, especially my academic colleagues. That's a bit too much, or do something at the level of the UN agencies. But and Apoorva, you've seen it, right? You get attacked all the time on either on social media or on emails, and all of us do. There's a open war on scientists and science right now, and it's real, and it is now a globalized movement. Unfortunately, it really took off in Texas, where I am, and has been accelerating ever since.
One very strange form that I've seen that kind of anti-science take is people who've had COVID sort of arguing online that natural immunity is far superior to the vaccines. And so why do I need to get vaccinated? My T cells are going to protect me, et cetera, et cetera. And there are actually a couple of questions here.
And we know that's not the case, right? I mean, we know not, some people do develop, if you've been very sick, some people develop really high levels of virus neutralizing antibody if they survive. But people with mild or asymptomatic illness often don't, or inconsistent levels. And so protection is not long lasting with natural infection a lot of the time. It was more with the original SARS back in 2003, but not as much with this one for reasons that we don't understand. So vaccine immunity is probably going to be better and more durable.
We also have seen, right, that the natural immunity doesn't seem to work very well against the South African variant, for example. But when people who've had COVID get even one shot of the vaccine, their immunity goes through the roof. The neutralizing antibodies go through the roof, and they can neutralize anything.
Yeah, because your previous, and if you have been infected with COVID-19, it's almost like getting the first immunization in a way, but you get a second for a first vaccine shot. That's almost like the boost, and those do well. So people like Eric Topol and others have been calling for maybe we can go to single dose vaccination for those individuals in order to conserve vaccine doses for the mRNA. And I think that has, and Mike Osterholm as well, and others. And I think that has validity. The problem is, how do you operationalize that at scale? We don't really have a very good health system in place for immunizing adults, as we've learned very much in 2020 and 2021. So how you operationalized doing pre-bleeds and see who's had antibodies before and giving them one dose, I think that's going to be very tough. We've learned in 2020 that our health system cannot tolerate a lot of complexity. We screwed up the diagnostic testing. We missed the entry of the virus coming in from Europe into New York City. We never got genomic sequencing underway at a big scale, and we can't do this either. So it's years and years of neglect in our health system and supporting our public health system infrastructure. And in its place, we've got Amazon Pharmacy. It turns out it's not quite the same. And so how we fix that is we're not going to fix it in this epidemic, but that makes it, some places I think have that capacity for testing people first and then giving them a single dose. I think at scale, it's going to be very hard for us to do
it. There's a question here from Dr. Daniel Griffin, who has infiltrated the Simons Foundation chat. But he says, Peter and Apoorva, great stuff and love the bow tie. I think that's why you're getting that OG villain comment, actually, Peter. It's because of the bow tie. But it says, any comments on the discussion around vaccine verification and required vaccinations for work, travel, or other activities? With more than 500,000 dead already, where does personal freedom end and social responsibility come into play?
Yeah, no, and greetings to Dr. Griffin, and who also rocks that bow tie really well. One of the things that I've been doing is, we did a study. I'm a vaccine scientist, but I partnered with a group of social scientists at Texas A&M University, led by Tim Callahan, looking at who are the two most vaccine hesitant groups. And I'll show you where I'm going with this in a minute. And what was interesting is we came up with the same results that the Kaiser Family Foundation found in terms of vaccine hesitancy. So both of us found the number two most vaccine hesitant groups are the African American populations, and I'll talk about that. But number one was what we call Trump voters and what they called Republicans, so the conservative right. So in response to that, I'm saying, look, I don't care who you are, I'm going to try to get you vaccinated. So I've been going on African American talk radio shows, almost every other day now for the last few weeks, and I've been going back on conservative news outlets. So I did Newsmax, I did back on Fox News, Daily Caller, and what's really interesting about the conservative sites is, because you really don't know what they're thinking until you've talked to people. And for them, one of the big issues has been they create this straw man. The straw man is around vaccine mandates. They're obsessed that people are just going to, again, this comes out of this health freedom, medical freedom nonsense that accelerated in 2015. They're convinced that, either the US government or the National Guard or soldiers in blue helmeted UN helmets are going to hold everybody down and vaccinate them. And so there's this obsession with mandates. And I say, look, right now, no one's talking about mandates. Maybe in the fall, I could envision, when my youngest son went off to college, he, being in the dormitories, he had to get proof of his meningococcal B vaccine and his meningococcal ACWY vaccine. So maybe for college students in dormitory settings, you might require. But beyond that, I think right now I wouldn't push the issue. First of all, we don't even have the vaccines available for mandates, and it it could backfire, maybe down the line, but I'm not even sure we're going to need that. I'm thinking that most people, I think vaccine acceptance is going to increase as people see the benefits of getting it. And we also, the other big perk for getting vaccinated is information coming out of Israel, where, and this was just published yesterday in the New England Journal of Medicine, that that in addition to halting symptomatic infection, 2 doses of the vaccine caused a 92% halting of asymptomatic transmission. In other words, when you get really high levels of virus neutralizing antibody, what happens is not only is in your cardiovascular system and stopping you from dying, but it's also going across your mucous membranes into your nasal secretion. So it's halting virus in your nose, mouth, and throat. And that's the reason why you have asymptomatic transmission. It's virus shedding from your nose, mouth, and throat. It seems to be stopping that. So why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because what I think it means, and I think we're going to see similar results. We already some evidence of this from the J&J and the AstraZeneca vaccine. These vaccines will stop asymptomatic transmission. The phase 3 trials were not designed to study it, but after the fact, I think it's going to look that way. So as we move towards fully vaccinating the US population, I think we may be in a position to no longer need masks. We can relax our social distancing requirements. We can get back to a much more normal quality of life with restaurants and everything else. Maybe not completely normal, but far better than what we've been experiencing. And I think that'll be a big incentive for people to want to get vaccinated when they see all of those added benefits.
There are a bunch of questions here about boosters. So how long will the vaccine's protection last? Will we need boosters like the flu boosters? Can we mix and match? Like if you get the first doses J&J, can you get Moderna or Pfizer first and then Moderna or things like that? So where do we stand on that?
Yeah, so I do, but first of all, we don't know. Since these vaccines are new technologies, we don't know what the durability of protection is, both in terms of levels of virus neutralizing antibody and also our memory B cells and T cells and all that sort of thing. So does protection last 3 months, 3 years, 30 years? We won't know till we know. So I think there's a likelihood we will need a booster shot, a third immunization in the case of Moderna and Pfizer, and a second in the case of the J&J. But I can't tell you whether it's going to be this fall or next year. I don't think we're going to need annual immunizations like we do for flu, because we're not going to see that level of variation. I'm hoping that there's so much convergence around what we call the SGTF, spike gene target failure or variants of concern, that that one booster that targets, say, the South African variant may be adequate for that, provided it gives you a big boost in neutralizing antibodies. So I don't think we're going to need annual immunizations, but I would not be surprised. I think it's likely we're going to need to get a third immunization, probably around the South African variant. In fact, those of us who are developing vaccines, I'm on Zoom calls every day now, trying to figure out how we do that. Do we now stop production and make a bivalent vaccine? In other words, 2 vaccines in one for the original, one for the South African? Or more likely, do we just move forward with our original vaccine and then aim towards creating a boost for the South African variant down the line? So in other words, if you get a booster of your mRNA vaccine, your Moderna vaccine or Pfizer vaccine with a third immunization, it won't be exactly the same. It'll feel exactly the same, and but it will actually be directed against one of these spike variants. And I think that's probably pretty likely.
I've actually heard that mixing and matching might be better because you might get more of a broad spectrum of response. I don't know if that's true. And obviously
mixing and matching with the same technology and the variants, I think that's probably likely. In terms of mixing and matching technologies, we might have to do that as well. And so, for example, the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is not doesn't look like it gives high levels of protection against the South African variant, will also need a third immunization. But because after getting 2 doses of that vaccine, which is made in adenovirus, you may be making antibodies to the adenovirus, and you can't use that for your third immunization. So we've been in discussions, maybe our recombinant protein vaccine would be a good boost. And in fact, when you look at the history of the early adenovirus vaccines, most of them were done as a heterologous prime boost, meaning immunizing with adenovirus and boosting with something called MVA, modified virus ankara, or recombinant protein. So there is a lot of experimental evidence to support that, and that's a possibility. So we're looking at our vaccine, for instance, not only as a standalone recombinant protein vaccine, but also as a booster and that kind of prime boost approach.
I want to ask you more about the global vaccine development and how, you know, vaccines like yours might play a role. But before that, I quickly want to ask, on the topic of these boosters, what will the testing and, you know, the FDA approval process look like, or authorization process look like for these boosters and these vaccines that we might make for the variants?
Yeah, I think the FDA is starting to issue some guidance documents. I think it would be too cumbersome to require a full-on phase 3 trial and expensive, and may not be necessary given that we've now got some experience with this. So I'm likely what they'll do is look for some level of equivalency, a smaller study in human volunteers showing that, one, it's safe, and second, that it can induce adequate virus neutralizing antibodies to the variant and also some T cell responses, and that may be adequate for that purpose. And you know, it's going to be harder and harder to randomize people in randomized controlled clinical trials, also because of the ethics of it in terms of withholding vaccines and things like that. So I think we'll, in time, as we get more experience, we may not need to go through those same in-depth phase 3 clinical trials that we went through for Operation Warp Speed.
Okay, so let's talk about, why do we need to vaccinate the rest of the world? Why should we even care? And what will that look like? I mean, I think something like 130 countries haven't even vaccinated a single person. So that's,
yeah, and I'm really worried about the low and middle income countries. And we knew this was going to be a problem. To the credit of the global policymakers, they jumped on this on day one, and a group which includes CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, and the Gavi Alliance and WHO, worked pretty quickly towards creating the COVAX sharing facility, which would provide equitable access to all vaccines. And it's starting to get reasonably well funded, and now the US is going to support it. They didn't before. Boris Johnson and the UK government really stepped up to support this. The problem is this, we just don't have a lot of vaccine for low and middle income countries. So the 2 mRNA vaccines are still pretty fussy in terms of scale up production. So we're not going to have those vaccines in abundance for low and middle income countries. And you have the onerous freezer requirements, which are often challenging in a place like, you name it, Ethiopia or Honduras and elsewhere. So I don't think the mRNA vaccines are going to have a big role. And when you start going down the list, you realize there's not going to be a heck of a lot out there for low and middle income countries. Merck is out. You know, they were looking at 2 replicating virus vaccines. They're no longer in it. Sanofi, Pasteur with GSK, which is the 2 of the largest vaccine producers, are significantly delayed. Then you've got the Gamaleya Russian vaccine of uncertain quality. Same with the Chinese vaccines from Sinovac, Sinopharm, and CanSino Bio, which produce very low levels of virus neutralizing antibody and are not probably going to may not work against the South African vaccine variant. Maybe Sinopharm will, but the others I don't think will. Then even the AstraZeneca vaccine may not work against the South African variant, and that's the one that's really accelerating now across the African continent. It's now in Zambia. It's going into southeastern Africa to Mozambique, Malawi. So I'm worried because when you start going down the list, there's not much out there. I think the J&J vaccine should be a good one, but we're seeing they're having some issues in terms of scale up. So I'm hoping that our recombinant protein vaccine might make a big difference, because it's an old school technology, the same technology used to make the hepatitis B vaccine, which has been around for 40 years, made in yeast, and it's cheap. They can Biological E, our partner, which is scaling up production now, making 1 billion doses, thinks they could do this for $1.50 a dose. So it's about the least expensive vaccine. So India has got enormous capacity for vaccine production. And so hopefully that will help fill the gap. But other than that, I'm worried. And again, this gets back to this very heavy emphasis on innovation. And I'm all for innovation. Of course, I'm an MD, PhD laboratory investigator. But I think everybody was so focused on innovation that they kind of lost sight of the fact that we just need some old school, non-fussy, durable vaccines for the world, and hopefully ours will come in and fill it. But even then, the amount of struggles we had to do to even get to that point. I mean, we didn't get any help really from anybody in the beginning in raising money. I mean, I wound up getting $1 million from Tito's Vodka. So, by the way, your next mixed drink where you have vodka, it's got to be Tito's Vodka. That's my only declared conflict of interest. You got to have Tito's Vodka. The Clayburgh Foundation, JPB Foundation, based in New York. I mean, they rescued us, and raising a few $1 million so we could do the technology transfer to BioE. But it's pretty incredible at the end of the day, with all the discussion about all these mechanisms in place, that's what we had to rely on. And now for the South African variant, we still don't have the funding for that. Now we're making that one. We still don't have the funding for it, but we're moving forward anyway. So, I think the COVAX facility, CEPI is now coming in to support our vaccine for biological E, and I'm really grateful from that. So that's also the Gates Foundation has been involved. But in the beginning, it was really rough sledding.
We only have about 6 minutes left, so I want to ask you a quick couple of questions, and then I want to ask you about that sandwich, Peter, so save time for that. But before we get to that, there's a question here about why do we need to vaccinate kids, since they don't seem to get sick and most of them are asymptomatic anyway? Why should we even bother?
Well, the reason is most of the time, you're right, they are asymptomatic or a low-grade symptom, but sometimes they do get very sick, so they are at risk for that, especially with these variants, looming large. Second, if we're going to interrupt transmission, I don't think we may not get enough adults immunized to get to that. Remember, with the variants coming around, I think herd immunity may more and more start looking like measles herd immunity, where we need 80. We originally thought 3/4 of the US population, we may need to move to 80-90%. You're not going to get there with adults alone. You're going to need adolescents and kids. So that's a reason for it. And that's true globally as well. So clinical trials are underway. And again, our vaccine, we hope, will be useful from that standpoint, since it uses the same technology as the hepatitis B vaccine that's been given to kids for decades, and maybe parents will feel more comfortable with that. But we're likely going to need to move to adolescents and kids, not right away. It'd be nice if we could do this in time for the fall school year. I don't know that we'll get there or not, but at least we'll have the teachers vaccinated and the staff and the bus drivers.
Seems like maybe older adolescents, right? Because those results are expected by June. So hopefully, if we hustle and get them authorized, maybe kids will be vaccinated.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true, and that's going to be important, because if you go into a pediatric ICU when there's a lot of COVID transmission, you see a lot of adolescents very sick with COVID, and a lot of them have comorbidities such as diabetes or obesity. Mm-hmm. So it's a population that we're going to need to vaccinate.
One last question before we get to the sandwich. Can you tell us about the challenge trials that are happening in the UK and what they'll tell us?
Yeah, I know there's been some strong proponents of it. I at this point not certain I see the need for challenge studies, given the fact that we've got so much transmission going on. I mean, you know, I remember, if you look on Twitter, people are always attacking me. Hey, Dr. Hotez, you said we're not going to have vaccines ready till 2021, and we already had 2 in 2020. I said, well, yeah, that's because we totally let this epidemic get out of control, and we had such a high attack rate that we got an answer faster than we thought. And that still seems to be the case. There's no shortage of COVID-19 transmission, unfortunately. So, the thing about challenge studies is they're not as easy as they've looked. We've done this now for our hookworm vaccine and our colleagues for schistosomiasis vaccine. It takes time to standardize the dose, to get a standard infection, to get reliable metrics, and to do this under GMP, good manufacturing practices, either with the virus, in our case, with hookworm larvae. It took us years to do it, and not with extra money. I'm sure you could accelerate that, but it's not a quick answer. People are making it sound like, oh yeah, just do a human challenge study. It's work, and there's a lot of regulatory oversight that goes into it.
Okay, so I've been mentioning the sandwich, and I think we all need to hear about it.
People are wondering what the heck you're talking about.
Exactly. So today on Twitter, I found out that there is a sandwich named after Peter. So can you please tell us more about this?
Yes, Apoorva. No, I have not gotten the Nobel Prize or the Lasker Prize, but it's okay, because now I have a sandwich named after me. It's called the Dr. Hotez, and it's being made by Anton's, who, if you're down in this part of the country, makes the po' boy sandwiches for the Texas Gulf Coast, and they're the best sandwich makers you can imagine. And they invited me to meet with them to design the Dr. Hotez sandwich, and they've made it a bit like a banh mi Vietnamese sandwich, with the very high quality, thinly sliced beef and crunchy things like carrots and pickled carrots and other things. It's quite delicious, and now you can get the Dr. Hotez sandwich. So I feel very honored and very thrilled. And the proceeds are going to partly go to Texas Children's Hospital. So it's all going for a good cause. So I made the joke. The anti-vaccine people for years have been saying to me that they're going to eat my lunch, and now I say now they can. So,
well, I think that's a good note to end on with sandwich. We've talked about sandwiches and vodka on top of all the vaccine information, so it's a good.
Yeah, you can have the sandwich with a glass of Tito's vodka.
That's right. So. That's right. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. This was incredibly interesting.